Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today to talk about oil shale in Israel, because over the last few years, starting about 5 years ago, there's really been a global change in the energy landscape. What we're seeing is that conventional oil continues to rise in price because there truly is a shortage of inexpensive conventional oil. But at the same time, we're starting to see unconventional oil. For example, shale oil shale, tar sands. These are becoming more and more important because they're driven not by scarcity. There's an enormous amount of these unconventional hydrocarbons, many times more than the conventionals. But their cost is driven entirely by technology. And as the technology has improved, the price of producing these unconventionals has gotten lower, and the prices crossed over a few years ago. So now you're starting to see a whole resurgence of oil and gas production in the United States that's just completely revolutionized the energy field there. You're seeing Canada becoming a major producer, going from about 1.7 million barrels per day, probably up to about 4 million barrels per day within the next decade. So these, you're seeing a shift in the global energy balance more towards the west, away from the Middle East and North Africa, which rely entirely on conventional oil. And in this milieu, we have Israel, which, believe it or not, has one of the best and largest oil shale reserves in the world. It's truly a national treasure, and it hasn't been tapped here at all. You might be curious how large this is, and where is it hiding in Israel? There's about 250 billion barrels of shale oil here in Israel. That's the size of Saudi Arabia. And it's not low-grade resource. The oil shale here is probably the second or first best in the world. It runs between 25 and 30 gallons per ton. That's on the scale of Colorado, the Piceance Basin in Colorado. It's 300 meters thick, extremely uniform rock. It's a chalk, but it was laid down in the Cretaceous period, which was a very prolific period for organic deposition. And it covers not just most of Israel, but also a large part of Jordan and into Syria and Turkey. So every country that bordered the Mediterranean has deposits like this, but Israel and Jordan have by far the most. Between them, something of the order of 750 billion barrels of shale, very high quality. And the oil shale is not just thick, but it's shallow. It has to be shallow because if it wasn't, this is a source rock. And if it were buried deeper and got hotter, the organic matter would have converted into oil and made a conventional oil reservoir. So you always find oil shale shallow, and that makes the drilling cost very low. So the natural thing is, if it's shallow, why not just mine it? And the answer is, in Israel, the mineable deposits of oil shale are in the Negev, and they're very small and low grade because they were quite a distance away from the ancient Mediterranean Sea. But along the coastal plain of Israel, where this was deposited, in the Shale Basin, there are about 300 to 500 meters of overburden, and you can't mine that economically, but you can certainly use in situ technology. In fact, that's sort of the ideal depth for having a cover on top of the oil shale. So let me tell you a little bit about the technology. This in situ conversion technology has been used in both Canada and in the United States, in both oil sands and in oil shale. It involves drilling very long horizontal wells, about 1 kilometer of length. And unlike the tar sands where you inject steam into the reservoir, in the case of oil shale, you basically use heaters, and you just heat the rock by thermal conduction. And over a period of several years, the temperature slowly rises to about 300 centigrade, and the organic matter, the solid organic matter in this rock, converts to gas and oil. It gets produced by conventional production wells, and at the surface, when you condense the gaseous products that come out, you wind up with about 2/3 oil and about 1/3 LPG and natural gas. The fact that it's drilled with horizontal wells is very important in Israel because it means it's a very small surface footprint. Only about 1 square kilometer of surface area is actually used during the 35-year process. You might be wondering about the energy source. We have to heat the rock up, so how can this be energy efficient? Well, one of the reasons is because we basically use natural gas. And when I came to Israel 4 years ago, I didn't know we were going to have so much natural gas in the Mediterranean. But natural gas is an ideal fuel for heating the subsurface because it's so available and because it has relatively low CO2 footprint compared to other fossil fuels. The heating process, though, is not limited to either electric or natural gas heaters. You have the ability to heat the subsurface also with solar and other wind power, renewable, depending on their relative cost and availability. And it turns out that when you have a very rich oil shale like this, when you have abundant natural gas for the heating source, and when it's shallow enough, that the economics place it roughly below $40 per barrel for the production of the oil. And that's in Israel, where we're importing essentially Brent crude at about $110 per barrel. So it's extremely economic. Another thing about the process is that it's completely self-sustaining. The amount of natural gas that gets produced along with the oil is sufficient to generate all the heat that's needed to heat the rock. So once you get started on natural gas, it becomes a self-sustaining process. Now I wanted to tell you a little bit about our company. Our company is Israel Energy Initiatives. We're a wholly owned subsidiary of Genie Energy, which is a New York Stock Exchange company. And we formed Israel Energy Initiatives in 2008, and I retired from Shale after 32 years of working on unconventionals to see if we could do for Israel what has occurred in Canada and the United States. So we were granted a license in the Shale Basin. We have 238 square kilometers, and that contains 40 billion barrels of shale oil. And we've now completed our exploration program there. We've drilled six wells. We've cored thousands of meters of core. We analyzed the core at Ben-Gurion University, where we've established our geochemical and geological laboratories. And one thing I can tell you about the deposit here in Israel, it's a very simple deposit, very simple basin, unfractured, and the hydrology is excellent. There's no recharge, there's essentially no connection whatsoever to the aquifers, and so this can be developed in a very environmentally sustainable manner. One thing I wanted to tell you about was the shale oil itself that gets made from this rock. I don't know if you can see this, but it's extremely light, about 35 API gravity, and has no heavy ends associated with it. And that's because all the heavy carbon is left behind in the rock during the heating process, and only the hydrogen-rich components are withdrawn. So that the refining of this shale oil is actually very easy. We're able to make an ultra-low sulfur diesel, a perfect jet fuel, and really good gasoline. Anyway, so where we stand now is what we have to do is do a pilot of the technology, very small-scale pilot on our acreage in the Shale. And then after that's successful, we will be going into commercial production. We should be able to make Israel completely energy independent within the decade. That's about 300,000 barrels per day of production. And this is, in my view, an opportunity that Israel really can't miss. It's an opportunity to do what Canada and the United States have done with their unconventionals. And I'm really excited about Israel's energy future. There's no doubt in my mind that Moses turned the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinegar.